Thank you. I know there are many expectations from this session. I hope we will not fail you very much. Thank you. Let me go straight to the not to the anathemas, but to the topic. The concept of the Russian world is as fluid as the ideological preferences of those who promote it. It existed even before the phrase Russian world was coined. It is a sort of civilizational exceptionalism that has permeated Russian political thinking and Russian culture in general since at least the early modernity. Then the idea of Moscow as the third Rome underlined an assumed special historical mission for the Muscovite state, which eventually grew to an empire. Russian civilizational exceptionalism took a shape of imperialism in the period of Romanov's empire. This period featured international colonization, which extended primarily to Siberia and other parts of Asia. Ukraine also became an object of Russia's intensive colonizing efforts. During the 18th and 19th centuries, such standard policies of colonization as suppression of native languages and cultures can be identified regarding Ukraine. Similar colonizing efforts continued after the end of the Russian Empire in the Soviet period. The Soviet Union, although rejected the imperial legacy of the Romanovs, effectively continued the imperial traditions of exceptionalism and colonialism. The artificial famine during the early 1930s, Holodomor, became the pinnacle of such policies. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian civilization exceptionalism was reimagined. A new phrase was coined to describe it, the Russian world. Four major stages can be identified in its evolution during the post-Soviet period. The earliest stage can be traced back to the 1990s. Then the phrase Russian world was introduced to the public discourse by the so-called methodologists. They perceived the Russian world as a part of the world's diversity. This world was envisaged as contributing to the global humanity by offering its best, primarily its creativity. The Russian world at that initial stage was seen not as better than other worlds, but equal to them. In other words, it was envisaged in universalist and inclusive and not particularist and exclusivist terms. It was designed as an instrument of liberalization and democratization of Russia. At this stage, the idea of the Russian world was elitist and did not appeal to the masses. The second stage of the evolution of the Russian world doctrine was marked by a radical U-turn. From contributing to the global civilization as an equal partner, the Russian world began to be perceived as a distinct and, in many points, superior civilization. It ceased to be seen as Western-like, but began to be imagined as uniquely Russian or Eurasian. At this stage, it converged with the long Russian tradition of civilizational exceptionalism, which goes back to Dostoevsky, and to the Moscow's third Rome ideas and so forth. At this point, the Kremlin became interested in the Russian world concept, which began to be discussed in various official and semi-official think tanks. This concept remained elitist and a sort of intellectual game. That's why it was harmless. Most of the Russian population could not comprehend it or identify themselves with this Russian world. At the third stage, the Russian Orthodox Church stepped in and geared up the evolution of the doctrine of the Russian world. This happened in the last years of the tenure of Alexei II as the Patriarch, who died in 2009. Its true demiurge was Metropolitan Kirill of Smolensk and Kaliningrad. After he became the Patriarch of Moscow in 2010, he fully invested himself into this doctrine and became its main ambassador and spokesperson. Owing to the Church, the Russian world obtained a metaphysical, eschatological, and messianic spin. It was rendered as a vessel of the so-called traditional values and anti-liberal and anti-globalist stronghold. At this stage of its evolution, the doctrine of the Russian world received more popularity among the ordinary Russians. The doctrine became Russia's soft power. However, this power grew increasingly harder as the Russian regime turned to be more authoritarian. Such a transformation of the doctrine was catalyzed by the events of the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in the winter 2013-2014. The Kremlin perceived this revolution as an existential threat to the integrity of the Russian world. of which Ukraine, so it believed, was an intrinsic part. To neutralize this imagined threat, in February 2014, Russia waged 2014, not 22. Russia waged a war in Ukraine, which continues to our days. So the war did not start in February 2022, it started in February 2014. Crimea was annexed and Donbass was invaded by the Russian forces, which sustained and still sustain the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. The Russian World Doctrine became the main source of narratives justifying this war and inspiring people to fight for its cause. The Russian military advances halted after the Ukrainian resistance and international efforts with the help of the so-called Minsk agreements actually contained this aggression. In Ukraine, the Russian aggression became associated with the Russian World Doctrine. Many Russian soft powers in Ukraine, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, started to be questioned by the Ukrainian society and state. Like, are you a part of this Russian world? And to save these powers, the official Russian speakers, primarily in the church, stopped referring to the Russian world. Some people felt that that was the end of the Russian world. You know, the officials stopped talking about it and it ended. But the officials did not abandon their doctrine. This doctrine remained on their minds. However, it should be acknowledged that there was a pause after 2014 when the Russian world was not mentioned officially. Only some kind of crazy people continued talking about it. It reemerged in the official rhetoric of the Moscow Patriarchate after the escalation of the Russian violence against Ukraine in February 2022. The fully scaled Russian intrusion was condemned by the international community. The metaphysical component of the justification of this intrusion was addressed in several declarations. The most famous of them is a declaration on the Russian World Ruski Mir teaching, which was published on March 13, 2022, and signed by around 1,500 theologians worldwide. And I know there are many sitting in this room who have signed it. This declaration became viral and was cited in many media. It also triggered various critical responses, including from the Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Kirill personally made a statement in support of the Russian world. He publicly referred to it as, I quote, a forefront of the Christian civilization. This coming back of the rhetoric supporting the Russian world marks the fourth stage of the evolution of this doctrine. It is the most violent and exclusivist form of this doctrine ever demonstrated. In contrast even to its third stage, which acknowledged some rights for the Ukrainian people and their culture to exist, the fourth stage completely denies any such right. Now Ukraine is just an anti-Russian fantasy that deserves only to be eliminated. Well, I have a personal experience to compare the third and the fourth stages of the Russian world. When it was at the third stage, Patriarch Kirill asked me personally to teach him some Ukrainian language. He apparently wanted to tell the Ukrainians about the Russian world in their own language. Now I doubt he would acknowledge that the Ukrainian language is worth learning or preserving. The mentioned declaration on the Russian World Ruski Mir teaching identified the Russian World Doctrine as a heresy. There is another critique of this declaration that came not from the Moscow Patriarchate, kind of officially, but from other theologians, some theologians who criticized this statement about whether the Russian world is really a heresy. And I'm going to address this point in the second part. That's good. That's a sign. In the second part of my presentation. And I'm going to slow down because this is important, and this is the most kind of scandalous part of my presentation. So, is the Russian world a heresy? Let me try to briefly answer this question. From my perspective again. I believe if by heresy we mean Trinitarian or Christological mistakes debated in the period from the 4th through the 7th century, the Russian world certainly cannot be categorized as a heresy. However, if we go back to the times before the 4th century, like to Irenaeus of Lyon, when Christianity faced the hostile pagan Greco-Roman world, we could draw some parallels with the Russian world doctrine. Both worlds, I mean the pagan Greco-Roman world and the Russian world, surprisingly, seem to feature the same dualistic, coercive, and riding on the confusion between religion and politics nature. So 3 features that identify in commonality between the world that Christianity faced in the 2nd, 3rd century and the Russian world. They are dualistic, coercive, and riding on the confusion between religion and politics. These features had become embodied in the religious trends and movements which St. Irenaeus and his like-minded contemporaries identified as heresies. In the same vein, I believe we could approach the Russian World Doctrine. It is dualistic, and I've written a lot about this dualistic character of the mentality behind the Russian world, because similar to the ancient dualistic teachings, such as Manichaeanism or Montanism, it sees the world as ontologically polarized between the godless West and Holy Rus. It is coercive to the point of instigating a large-scale bloodshed, which we see with horror in Ukraine. Finally, we observe the politicization of religion to the degree comparable with the period from Augustus to Diocletian. It's so Roman and so pagan, this kind of politicization of religion. St. Irenaeus and his confederates perceived heresies as pagan thinking camouflaged as Christian. I would interpret the Russian world in a similar way. Another aspect which I would like to touch upon is an assumed ethnophyletic character of the Russian world. And I'm going to argue that Russian world is not ethnophyletic at all. Yesterday, Metropolitan Ambrosius boldly and eloquently connected the Russian world with ethnophyletism. As we all know, Philetism was condemned in 1872 by the Council of Constantinople, which defined it as an approach that brings to the church national differences, philetike diakrisis, and causes controversies on the ethnic grounds, ethniki eris. The council did not call Philetism heresy, though, contrary to the common wisdom. It did not call. However, the official press of the Ecumenical Patriarchate at the time called it so as a heresy. For example, the official periodical of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Ecclesiological, characterized Philetism as heterodoxy, literally kakodoxia ke heterodoxia, and the Antichrist's doctrine, quite strong wording, antichristianiki didaskalia. Well, I decided to drop vulgariki antichristianiki didaskalia, the original phrase. The Pan-Orthodox Council, which was held in Crete in June 2016, revisited Philetism. It affirmed the ecumenical character of the Council in Constantinople in 1872 and confirmed the condemnation of Philetism. After the escalation of the war in Ukraine in February 2022, the most senior churches of Constantinople and Alexandria tried to connect the Russian world doctrine with ethnophyletism. Thus, the Holy Synod of the Patriarchate of Alexandria, at its session on November 22, 2022, I quote the communique of the Patriarchate, condemned the new ecclesiastical political theories of spreading the Russian world around the globe on the basis of nationality, end of quote. At the same time, the communique from the Alexandrian Patriarchate did not explicitly connect the Russian world with ethnophyletism. Such a connection was made 3 weeks later, very recently in mid-December, by the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. In his speech at the opening of the International Conference World Policy Conference for a Reasonably Open World in Abu Dhabi, he claimed that, I quote, the link with the past of ethnophyletism and the present of the Russian world is obvious, end of quote. It seems that there is a growing conviction among senior hierarchs that the Russian world ideology can be condemned as a reincarnation of the old ethnophyletism. The reality, let us be honest to each other and to ourselves, is that almost all local Orthodox churches are affected by ethnophyletism, each to its own degree. If we want to condemn the Russian Orthodox Church of ethnophyletism, it can backfire. We should condemn ourselves. To accuse only the Russian Orthodox Church of ethnophyletism would be unfair, I believe. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church has demonstrated the highest degree of ethnophyletism ever seen. Even the Balkan Wars in the early 20th century were less ethnophyletic. They were ethnophyletic, but not to the same degree, because they were less cruel and bloody than the Russian world in Ukraine. Moreover, I believe it is more accurate to call the Russian world not ethnophyletic, but just philetic, a philetic doctrine. The Russian world claims to be above ethnic boundaries. That is their point. They say we are not about ethnos, we are above ethnos. It asserts that the Russian-speaking nations, several nations of Eastern Europe or even Central Asia, can constitute one people, единый народ, which can be rendered in Greek as phili. Therefore, what can and should be condemned in the case of the Russian world is not ethnophyletism, but violent philetism, with emphasis on violent. Let me briefly explore in the end one more potentially heretical aspect of the Russian world. The Council of Crete in 2016 called philetism as ecclesiological heresy. I find this adjective very promising in treating the Russian world doctrine. Is the ecclesiology behind the Russian world wrong? I believe so. As our Lord said, by their fruits you shall know them. Metropolitan Ambrosius yesterday described some bitter fruits of the Russian philetism in Korea. We can also see how corrupted ecclesiology has urged the Moscow Patriarchate to abstain from going to Crete in 2016, then to unilaterally break relations with other churches, and finally to develop uncanonical activities in Africa. The way how the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate nowadays treat the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine is another indication of their distorted ecclesiological consciousness. For example, they would go as far as to rebaptize the members of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which, I should remind us, is in full communion with at least some Orthodox churches, including the Ecumenical Patriarchate. They would rebaptize them. The distorted ecclesiology that underpins the Russian world ideology features a series of reductionisms. The universal church, seen through the lenses of the Russian world, is being effectively reduced to a local church, the Moscow Patriarchate. Well, that's why many people in Ukraine are really existentially afraid to leave the Moscow Patriarchate, because they believe that salvation is possible only there. They almost say in the creed, I believe in one Catholic apostolic holy church of the Moscow Patriarchate, This local church, in its turn, is reduced to its patriarch, who runs it unilaterally, with the synodal institutions functioning as a smokescreen. Finally, allow me to use a differentiation I made in my earlier ecclesiological studies between the nature and the structures of the church. In the case of the Russian church, we are dealing with an extremal case of the substitution of the church's nature with its administrative structures. I believe, as a result, the Russian church is completely silent about the war in Ukraine, because they believe that only its administration is allowed to speak about the war, and when the administration speaks about the war, it does so in its favor. The voice of the entire church has been reduced to the pro-war statements of its administrative apparatus. Well, in the end, all heresies are primarily reductionisms of orthodoxy. The fourth terminal stage of the Russian world, I deliberately chose 4 stages, like in the cancer. That is the terminal stage. The fourth terminal stage of the Russian World Doctrine has produced an ecclesiology which is clearly such a reductionism. It is condemnable and, in my judgment, amounts to an ecclesiological heresy, to use the terminology of the Pan-Orthodox Council in Crete. Thank you.